My name is James Jimmy Randall. I was a corporal in the 101st Airborne Division, known as the Screaming Eagles, during the Vietnam War in 1968. I joined up when I was barely 18, fresh out of high school in a small town in Kentucky. I didn't know much about the world back then, but I figured serving my country was the right thing to do. I got shipped out to Vietnam in early April that year, scared out of my mind, but pretending I wasn't, just like all the other guys. The place we were stationed was a village called Khe Sanh. It was tucked away in a dense jungle, the kind you only see in movies. The air felt like you could drink it, thick with heat and the smell of wet earth. The sounds of the jungle, birds, insects, and God knows what else, never stopped. It was a constant buzz that made it impossible to sleep at first. But you get used to it. You get used to a lot of things. Our unit was tasked with patrolling the area around Khe Sanh. The brass called it maintaining a presence, but we all knew it meant hunting down Viet Cong patrols and trying not to get ambushed ourselves. The Viet Cong knew those jungles like the backs of their hands. They'd vanish into the trees, set up traps, and always seemed to know where we were before we did. One day in late May, we got word of enemy movement about 5 clicks north of our position. A scout team had spotted a group of Viet Cong transporting supplies, likely weapons, through the jungle. Command sent us out to intercept. Our squad was 10 men strong, led by Sergeant William Bill Mathers. Bill was a no-nonsense kind of guy, the kind who could scare you straight with just a look. But he cared about his men. He had this way of making you feel like you'd be okay, even when you knew you might not be. I was carrying my trusty M16 that day, with an M26 grenade clipped to my vest, just in case. Each of us had a couple of those grenades, along with enough ammo to last a firefight. But it never felt like enough. We moved out at first light, sticking to the trails we'd hacked out of the jungle over the past few weeks. The terrain was brutal. You had to watch every step, not just for the undergrowth, but for traps. The Viet Cong loved their punji stakes, sharpened bamboo sticks hidden under the leaves, ready to pierce through your boots. About 2 hours into the patrol, our point man, a guy named Mike, signaled for us to stop. He'd spotted something up ahead. We crouched low, trying to blend into the jungle as best we could. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the enemy could hear it. Mike crept forward, motioning for Bill to join him. They whispered back and forth for a minute before Bill turned to us and whispered, "They're up ahead. About a dozen of them. Looks like they've stopped to rest. We're going to hit them hard and fast. Flank left and stay quiet." We spread out, moving as silently as we could through the jungle. I could feel the sweat dripping down my back, soaking through my fatigues. Every step felt like it might give us away. When we were in position, Bill gave the signal, a sharp whistle. We opened fire, our M16s cracking through the humid air. The Viet Cong were caught off guard, scrambling for cover as we advanced. I remember the chaos of it, the shouting, the gunfire, the way the jungle seemed to come alive with movement. But the Viet Cong weren't pushovers. They fired back, their AK-47s rattling loudly. I hit the dirt, squeezing off shots at a shadowy figure darting between the trees. The guy went down, but I didn't have time to feel anything about it. Then I heard it, a sharp metallic click. One of our guys had tripped a claymore mine. The sound of that claymore mine going off wasn't something I'll ever forget. It was a deep, thunderous crack that seemed to shake the whole jungle. The blast sent dirt, leaves, and pieces of shrapnel flying everywhere. I felt a sharp sting on the side of my face and instinctively hit the ground, covering my head with my hands. When the dust settled, I looked up to see who'd tripped the mine. It was Carl, one of the newer guys in the squad. He'd been walking point earlier, but had swapped out with Mike just before we engaged. The blast had hit him full force. His body lay crumpled on the jungle floor, his rifle twisted and useless. "Medic!" Sergeant Mathers shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Doc Peterson, our medic, was already moving toward Carl, his pack rattling with supplies as he scrambled over the uneven ground. The rest of us kept firing, trying to keep the Viet Cong pinned down while Doc did his work. I wanted to look away, but my eyes kept darting toward Carl. He wasn't moving, and deep down I knew there wasn't much Doc could do for him. Still, Doc knelt beside him, muttering words none of us could hear over the gunfire. The fight raged on, bullets snapping past us like angry wasps. I spotted another Viet Cong darting through the trees and squeezed off a burst from my M16. He went down, disappearing into the undergrowth. "Randall, cover the left flank," Bill barked. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest, and saw two Viet Cong trying to circle around us. I dropped to one knee, aimed carefully, and fired. The first guy went down, clutching his chest. The second hesitated, and that was all I needed. I fired again, and he fell. "Good shooting, Jimmy," someone yelled, but I couldn't tell who it was. My ears were ringing, and my hands felt numb from gripping the rifle so hard. After what felt like an eternity, the gunfire started to die down. The Viet Cong were retreating, melting back into the jungle as quickly as they'd appeared. "Cease fire," Bill ordered, his voice hoarse. "Stay sharp and keep your eyes open. They might come back." We regrouped, checking on each other and assessing the damage. Carl was gone. Doc had done everything he could, but the blast had been too much. His body was still lying there, and I couldn't bring myself to look at him again. "Damn it," Bill muttered, running a hand through his sweat-soaked hair. "All right, we can't stay here. We're sitting ducks if they regroup." Jimmy might grab Carl. "We're taking him back." I nodded, swallowing hard. Mike and I lifted Carl's body, trying to be as gentle as we could. He felt heavier than I expected, and I could feel the warm stickiness of his blood on my hands. We started moving, sticking to the trails, and keeping our eyes peeled for any signs of movement. The jungle felt even more oppressive now, the air thick with the smell of sweat, dirt, and gunpowder. Every shadow looked like an enemy waiting to strike. After about an hour, we reached a small clearing where we could catch our breath. Bill had us set up a perimeter while we waited for a radio check. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant bird calls. While we waited, I couldn't stop thinking about Carl. He'd been quiet but friendly, always willing to share his rations or help out with gear. He'd only been with us for a couple of months, and now he was gone. Just like that. "Jimmy," Bill said, pulling me out of my thoughts. "You okay?" I nodded, but I wasn't sure if it was true. "Yeah, I'm fine." Bill didn't push it. He just patted me on the shoulder and moved on to check on the others. After a few minutes, Doc came over and sat down next to me. He looked exhausted, his hands still stained with Carl's blood. "You did get out there," he said. "Doesn't feel like it," I replied. Doc sighed, leaning back against a tree. "It never does. But you kept us alive. That's what matters." Before I could say anything else, the radio crackled to life. It was command telling us to fall back to the base. They wanted a full report on the engagement and an update on our patrol route. We packed up and started moving again, the jungle closing in around us. The hike back felt like it took forever. Every step was heavier than the last, and my arms ached from carrying Carl. When we finally made it back to Key Sand, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the base. We handed Carl's body off to the medics, who would prepare him for transport back to his family. The rest of us were debriefed by the brass, but I barely heard a word they said. My mind was elsewhere, replaying the ambush over and over again. I kept wondering if there was something I could have done differently, something that might have saved Carl. That night, I couldn't sleep. The jungle sounds outside the base were too loud, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw the explosion. I saw Carl. Eventually, I gave up trying to rest and joined a few of the guys at the makeshift bar we'd set up near the barracks. We didn't talk much, just sat there nursing warm beers and staring at nothing in particular. "Here's to Carl," Mike said finally, raising his can. "To Carl," we all echoed, our voices low. We didn't talk about it after that, at least not for a while. We had more patrols to run, more fights to survive. But Carl stayed with me. He still does, even now, all these years later. A few days after we lost Carl, we were sent out on another mission. The higher-ups had intelligence about a potential Viet Cong supply route running through the jungle west of Key Sand. Our job was to locate it, gather intel, and, if possible, disrupt their operations. They wanted us to plant explosives on any supply caches or routes we could find. The squad was still reeling from the ambush, but we didn't have the luxury of dwelling on it. In Vietnam, you learn to push things down and focus on the task in front of you, because if you didn't, you wouldn't make it back. We left the base at dawn, the sky just starting to turn pink over the treetops. The jungle was quiet, aside from the usual background hum of insects and birds. It always amazed me how peaceful it could seem, even though we knew death could be waiting around any corner. This time, Bill put Mike back on point with me covering the rear. The rest of the squad spread out in a staggered formation, moving carefully through the dense foliage. The air was heavy with humidity, and every step felt like a struggle. Sweat soaked through our fatigues within minutes, and the straps of my pack dug into my shoulders. After a couple of hours, we came across a well-worn trail cutting through the jungle. It was too wide to be an animal path, and the way it was cleared told us it was likely used by the Viet Cong. Bill signaled for us to stop and gather around. "Looks like we found what we're looking for," he said in a low voice. "Jimmy, Mike, you two take point. The rest of us will follow. Keep your eyes peeled for traps or signs of movement." Mike and I nodded and took the lead. The trail was narrow, with thick undergrowth on either side. I scanned the ground for tripwires or anything else that looked out of place. The Viet Cong were masters of camouflage and could turn even the simplest patch of jungle into a death trap. We followed the trail for about half a mile before we came to a small clearing. In the middle of it was a cache of supplies, wooden crates stacked neatly and covered with a camouflage net. It was exactly what we'd been sent to find. Bill motioned for us to fan out and secure the area. We moved cautiously, keeping our weapons at the ready. My heart was pounding, and my finger hovered over the trigger of my M16. "Looks clear," Bill said after a thorough sweep. "Jimmy, Doc, you two check out the cache. The rest of you keep watch." Doc and I approached the crates, pulling back the netting to get a better look. Inside, we found ammunition, medical supplies, and several bundles of what looked like explosives. "Looks like they were gearing up for something big," Doc said, his voice low. "Yeah," I replied, my eyes scanning the rest of the cache. "Probably setting up for an ambush or resupplying their units in the area." Bill joined us and took a closer look. "We'll set charges and blow this to hell. Jimmy, you take the left side. Doc, you take the right. I'll handle the middle." We worked quickly, planting explosives on the crates and setting the timers. I couldn't stop thinking about how exposed we were. If the Viet Cong came back while we were still here, we'd be sitting ducks. As soon as the charges were in place, Bill ordered us to fall back to a safe distance. We hunkered down behind a cluster of trees, our eyes on the clearing. "Detonating in 3, Bill said, pressing the button on the detonator. The explosion rocked the jungle, sending a plume of smoke and debris into the air. The ground shook beneath us, and the noise was deafening. When the smoke cleared, the cache was nothing but a smoldering pile of rubble. "Good work, boys," Bill said. "Let's move out before the Viet Cong come looking for us." We started back down the trail, but we didn't get far before we heard voices. They were speaking in rapid Vietnamese, and they were close. "Down!" Bill hissed, and we all dropped to the ground, melting into the undergrowth. Through the trees, I saw a group of about 10 Viet Cong soldiers moving toward the clearing. They were armed with AK-47s, and their leader carried a radio pack on his back. They were clearly coming to check on the cache. Bill signaled for us to hold fire and let them pass, but something must have tipped them off. Maybe they saw a footprint, or maybe they just knew something was wrong. Either way, the lead soldier raised his rifle and started scanning the jungle. My heart was racing. I tightened my grip on my M16, ready to fire if they spotted us. Then, one of the Viet Cong stepped on a branch, and the crack seemed to echo through the trees. It was all the excuse we needed. "Light him up," Bill shouted, and we opened fire. The jungle erupted in chaos. Bullets tore through the undergrowth, and the Viet Cong scattered, firing wildly as they tried to take cover. I lined up my sights on a soldier and squeezed the trigger. He went down, but there was no time to think about it. Another one was moving toward me, and I fired again, the recoil jolting my shoulder. The firefight was intense, but brief. The Viet Cong were outnumbered and caught off guard, and within minutes it was over. "Everyone okay?" Bill called out, his voice cutting through the ringing in my ears. There were a few murmured affirmatives, but no one was seriously hurt. "Let's move before reinforcements show up," Bill said, his tone grim. We didn't waste any time. We moved quickly, leaving the trail and cutting through the jungle to avoid any more patrols. By the time we made it back to base, we were exhausted but alive. That night, as I lay in my bunk, I couldn't stop replaying the events in my head. The way the Viet Cong leader had looked right at us before we opened fire. The sound of the explosion as the cache went up in flames. The faces of the soldiers we'd taken down. I kept telling myself it was them or us, but it didn't make it any easier. After the ambush on the Viet Cong patrol and blowing their supply cache, things didn't calm down for us. Command had us running constant patrols, gathering intel, and engaging the enemy whenever we could. It felt like we were trying to hold back an ocean with a bucket. Every time we knocked them down, they'd come back stronger, more organized, and more determined. About 2 weeks after the cache mission, we got orders to clear out a small village suspected of harboring Viet Cong forces. The village, named Bin Qua, was about 5 clicks from our base and deep in the jungle. The locals there weren't friendly, but they weren't hostile either. At least, not on the surface. It was the kind of place where you could feel the tension in the air, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. We moved out at dawn, as usual. This time we had support, 2 guys from the intelligence unit and a translator named Lin. Lin was young, probably no older than 20, but he spoke perfect English and seemed to know his way around the jungle. He walked with a quiet confidence that put some of us at ease, though Mike kept muttering under his breath about not trusting him. The trek to Bin Qua was uneventful, but that only made me more nervous. It was too quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of our boots crunching on the dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves. When we reached the village, the locals were already outside their huts, watching us with blank expressions. It was a small place, maybe 10 or 12 bamboo houses with thatched roofs. Chickens and pigs wandered around, oblivious to the tension in the air. Bill motioned for us to spread out and secure the perimeter. "Keep your eyes open," he said. "Anything looks off, you call it out." I took up a position near one of the huts, my M16 at the ready. A woman holding a baby stood nearby, her eyes darting between me and the rest of the squad. She didn't say a word, just clutched her child like we might snatch him away at any moment. Lin and the intel guys started talking to the village elder, an old man with a wiry frame and a face like weathered leather. They were asking about Viet Cong activity in the area, but the elder kept shaking his head, insisting that they hadn't seen any Viet Cong. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. The villagers were too calm, too practiced in their fear. It was like they'd been through this routine before and knew exactly how to act. As I scanned the area, my eyes landed on a teenage boy standing near the edge of the village. He was holding a basket of what looked like fruit, but his body language was off. He kept glancing toward the tree line, shifting his weight from foot to foot like he was waiting for something. "Hey, Sarge," I called out, keeping my voice low. "Something's not right about that kid." Bill came over and followed my gaze. He frowned and nodded. "Mike, Jimmy, check it out. Keep it quiet." We approached the boy slowly, trying not to spook him. He saw us coming and froze, his eyes wide. "Easy, kid," Mike said, his voice calm but firm. "We just want to talk." The boy didn't move, didn't say a word. He just stood there clutching the basket like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. I was about to say something when I noticed a glint of metal peeking out from under the basket. My stomach dropped. "God!" I shouted, raising my rifle. Before I could fire, the kid dropped the basket and bolted toward the trees. Mike and I chased after him, but he was fast, darting through the undergrowth like he'd been born in it. "Jimmy, cut him off!" Mike yelled, veering left while I took the right. I pushed through the thick foliage, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the kid crashing through the bushes ahead of me, and I was gaining on him. Then I heard it, the unmistakable metallic click of a tripwire. "Get down!" I shouted, throwing myself to the ground just as the explosion went off. The blast was deafening, and the shockwave knocked the wind out of me. I scrambled to my feet, coughing from the dust and smoke. The kid was gone, and the trail was a mess of shattered trees and churned up earth. Mike caught up to me, his face pale. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said, though my ears were ringing and my legs felt like jelly. Damn kid led us right into a trap. We made our way back to the village, where the rest of the squad was on high alert. The explosion had spooked the villagers, and they were now huddled together, murmuring in low voices. "What happened?" Bill demanded as we approached. "Kid had a basket with a gun hidden in it," I explained. "Led us into a claymore. We're lucky it didn't take us both out." Bill cursed under his breath and turned to Lynn. "Asked him about the traps." "Now." Lynn nodded and started questioning the elder again, but the old man stuck to his story, insisting they knew nothing about any traps or Viet Cong activity. Meanwhile, the rest of us searched the village for anything suspicious. It didn't take long to find it. Behind one of the huts, buried under a pile of firewood, we found a stash of weapons. AK-47s, grenades, and even a few RPGs. Bill's face darkened when he saw the cache. They'd been lying to us. He ordered us to gather the villagers and line them up in the center of the village. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. "What do we do now?" Mike asked, his voice low. "We destroy the weapons and report back to command," Bill said. "And we keep an eye on these people until reinforcements arrive." I could tell he wasn't happy about the situation. None of us were. It was impossible to know who we could trust, and every decision felt like it could backfire. As we started setting charges on the weapons cache, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The jungle around the village seemed to press in closer, the shadows growing longer as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Then, just as we finished planting the explosives, the first shot rang out. The crack of the rifle shot tore through the tense silence, and all hell broke loose. Before we could react, a barrage of gunfire erupted from the tree line, bullets zipping through the village and sending villagers scattering in all directions. "Contact! Get to cover!" Bill shouted, diving behind a pile of sandbags near the hut with the weapons cache. I hit the ground and crawled toward the nearest cover, a low wooden fence. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking as I gripped my M16. The jungle seemed alive with movement, shadows flickering between the trees as the Viet Cong advanced. Mike slid in beside me, his face pale but determined. They must have been waiting for us to make a move. The damn kid probably warned them. "Yeah, well, they've got us pinned now," I muttered, peeking over the fence to get a look at the situation. The Viet Cong were well coordinated, using the dense jungle as cover while they fired on us. I could see flashes of muzzle fire from the treetops, which meant they had snipers. The villagers were caught in the crossfire, some of them running for the safety of their huts, while others dropped to the ground, screaming in terror. Bill's voice cut through the chaos, calm and steady despite the gunfire. "Jimmy," Mike lay down, suppressing fire. "Doc, Lynn, get the villagers to safety. Everyone else, hold your positions and watch for movement." I nodded and popped up from behind the fence, squeezing off a few bursts in the direction of the tree line. The sound of my rifle was deafening, but it felt good to fight back, even if I wasn't sure I was hitting anything. Mike joined in, his M16 spitting out rounds in quick, controlled bursts. The two of us focused on keeping the Viet Cong heads down while Doc and Lynn corralled the villagers. Lynn was shouting in Vietnamese, waving his arms to direct the people toward the far side of the village. Doc was right behind him, ushering the villagers along while keeping his rifle at the ready. "We're sitting ducks here," Mike shouted over the gunfire. "We need to fall back." He was right. The Viet Cong had the advantage, and it was only a matter of time before they flanked us. "Bill," I called out, "we gotta move." Bill didn't respond right away. He was busy firing at a group of Viet Cong who had broken from the tree line and were trying to close the distance. "Jimmy's right," he finally shouted. "Pull back to the south side of the village. We'll regroup there." Mike and I laid down more suppressing fire as the squad started to move. The rest of the team fell back in pairs, covering each other as they went. When it was our turn, we ran like hell, weaving between the huts and keeping our heads low. The south side of the village was more open, with a small rice paddy stretching out toward another patch of jungle. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than being boxed in where we were. We regrouped near a cluster of large rocks, using them as makeshift cover. Bill quickly assessed the situation, his face grim. "They've got us outnumbered and outgunned," he said. "We need to call in air support." The radio operator, a young guy named Tommy, was already on it. He had the handset pressed to his ear, shouting coordinates into the mic while bullets whizzed overhead. "Air support's on the way," he said after a moment. "ETA 10 minutes. 10 minutes is a long damn time," Mike muttered, reloading his rifle. "Then we hold the line," Bill said firmly. "Jimmy, Mike, take the left flank. Doc, you're with me on the right. Tommy, stay low and keep that radio safe. Everyone else, spread out and make every shot count." We moved into position, the adrenaline dulling the ache in my legs and the burning in my lungs. The Viet Cong were advancing again, using the huts and other cover to get closer. I spotted one of them darting between two trees and fired, the recoil jolting my shoulder. He went down, but two more took his place. "Where the hell are those planes?" Mike growled, firing off another burst. "They'll get here," I said, more to reassure myself than him. The fight felt like it went on forever, but in reality, it was probably only a few minutes. The Viet Cong kept coming, relentless and fearless, while we held our ground as best we could. Then, just when it felt like we couldn't hold them off any longer, I heard it, the distant roar of jet engines. "Air support's here," Tommy shouted, his voice filled with relief. We hunkered down as two F-4 Phantoms screamed overhead, their wings loaded with bombs. The ground shook as they dropped their payloads, the explosions tearing through the jungle and sending plumes of smoke and fire into the air. The Viet Cong scattered, their attack broken by the airstrike. Those who weren't caught in the blast melted back into the jungle, leaving the village eerily quiet. Bill stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Everyone okay?" There were a few nods and murmured affirmatives. Doc was already moving to check on the villagers, who were huddled together near one of the huts. I slumped against the rocks, my hands still gripping my rifle. My ears were ringing, and my body felt like it had been through a meat grinder, but I was alive. We all were. As the adrenaline wore off, the weight of what had just happened started to sink in. The village was in ruins, the huts riddled with bullet holes, and the ground scorched from the bombs. The villagers looked at us with a mix of fear and anger, and I couldn't blame them. We'd come here to help, but all we'd brought was destruction. "Let's clean up and get out of here," Bill said quietly. "We'll leave the rest to command." We gathered our gear and prepared to move out. The villagers didn't say anything as we left, but their silence spoke volumes. The walk back to base was a heavy one. None of us spoke much, and even the jungle seemed quieter, like it was holding its breath. I kept going over the events in my head, trying to make sense of it all, but nothing added up. We'd done our job, sure, but at what cost? When we finally reached the perimeter of our camp, the familiar sight of sandbags and barbed wire brought a strange mix of relief and guilt. We made it back, but that village, the people there, had been left in shambles. Command debriefed us immediately. Bill gave the rundown of what happened. The intel, the ambush, the discovery of the weapons cache, and the firefight. He kept it matter of fact, but I could see the weight in his eyes. "What about the villagers?" one of the officers asked. "They're alive," Bill said, "but they've lost everything." The officer nodded, jotting down notes like it was just another day at the office. Maybe for him it was. After the debrief, we were dismissed to our barracks. The mood was somber. Even Mike, who usually cracked jokes to lighten the mood, stayed quiet. I sat on my cot, staring at my boots, replaying the moment I saw the boy with the basket. Could I have handled it differently? Maybe if we'd approached him another way, none of this would have happened. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the village, the faces of the people, the look of fear and betrayal in their eyes. I kept hearing the explosion, the screams, and the roar of the jets as they tore through the jungle. Around midnight, I stepped outside for some air. The camp was quiet except for the distant hum of generators and the occasional shout from the guards on patrol. I lit a cigarette and leaned against a stack of crates, letting the smoke calm my nerves. "You all right?" I turned to see Bill standing a few feet away, his face lit by the glow of his own cigarette. "Not really," I admitted. "Can't stop thinking about the village. About the kid." Bill nodded, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Yeah, me too. Do you think we did the right thing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Bill was quiet for a long time, staring out into the darkness. Finally, he said, I don't know. Out here, right and wrong get blurry. We're just trying to survive and do our jobs. Sometimes that means making choices that don't sit well later. I didn't say anything. What could I say? The days that followed weren't any easier. Word of the mission spread through the camp, and while no one said it outright, I could tell some of the other guys didn't agree with how it went down. A few of the villagers had come to the base seeking shelter, and seeing their faces brought it all back. But there wasn't time to dwell on it. The war didn't stop for anyone's conscience. We were sent out on another patrol just a few days later, and the cycle continued. Now, looking back all these years later, I still think about that mission, about Ben Kwa and the people we left behind. I wonder what happened to them after we left, if they rebuilt their lives, or if they were swallowed up by the war like so many others. I've told this story to a few people over the years, but it's not something I share easily. It's not a story about heroism or victory. It's a story about the cost of war. The things you carry with you long after the fighting's done. I wish I could say I've made peace with it, but the truth is I haven't. Maybe I never will. But I keep telling myself that what we did to survive, to protect each other. And maybe, in some twisted way, that makes it worth it. Or maybe it doesn't.